All right, so welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, and I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. And as I say, I don't know how we're going to be doing here on my generator. We also, somebody asked me to enable captions, and I thought I had done so. I can't see on my little uh, thumbnail where I can watch this. I don't see them, and I'm sorry for that. They do show up on the replay, and I'll try and figure this out. The whole upgrade has been really traumatic here. All right, so I'm looking through here. Any more questions that are jumping out? Um, all these people are writing to me from all these great places. And here, it was 40 degrees yesterday and gorgeous. And it's supposed to be 40 degrees tomorrow and gorgeous. And today it was 5 degrees when we woke up with a wind chill that threw us into the negative numbers. And I have never seen wind like we've got today. Buddy says he's seen wind like this, but I haven't seen it before here. All right. Joe, I forgot about the Coastal Bend project, and that I need to jump back on. I'll stop reading my notes now and tell you about your questions today. So, what you people have started out by asking about in a big way is what's happening with Governor Greg Abbott in Texas and his announcement this afternoon that he is reopening the state 100%, getting rid of all the COVID-related protocols now, which is kind of a shock, kind of a surprise in that only about 6.5% of the Texas population has been fully vaccinated. Way, way below what we need to have for herd immunity, which is about 70%. And in Texas, still about 200 people a day are dying. So what is he doing? Well, let's start by stepping back a little bit to the outbreak of the coronavirus about a year ago right now. And think about that, if you will, for a minute. Normally, in my lifetime anyway, and I suspect in most of your lifetimes, the way that America has handled pandemics, and you forget about it, but we have had pandemics again and again and again, but you've forgotten about it because generally we handle them pretty well. The most recent exception to that, of course, is the AIDS epidemic, and that was the moment in the 1980s in which Anthony Fauci actually went into the government, and Fauci has been behind handling a lot of our epidemics since, and they did not become widespread epidemics or a pandemic, which means it's over a number of countries, since 1984, largely because of the way the pandemics were handled. And the way they were handled was increasingly the federal government took on the problem of dealing with a pandemic, of dealing with an epidemic. So we had H1N1 under President Obama, and that a lot of people died. We have had Lyme disease. We have had, which by the way, they're talking about having a vaccine for that, which is a huge deal up here. We have had, I can't, of course, off the top of my head, I can't think of all of them. Ebola came to this country very, very briefly because it was imported. 2 people had it here, but it didn't spread. Anyway, we've had all these pandemics. But one of the things that the United States government did after 1933, and especially beginning in World War II in the 1940s, between 1941 and 1945, was to focus on health, to focus on making sure that Americans were healthy. And they did that in a number of different ways, certainly by having a number of federal agencies to monitor health and to work with health. We worked with the World Health Organization, which was an international version of that, of making sure people were healthy. And of course, during the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower being a Republican, we got the Department of Health and Human Services, which was originally designed to guarantee that we all had health care, and that foundered, and I won't tell you that story now. But the point is that everybody in America coming out of World War II had faith in the federal government to go ahead and manage public health. In addition to that, and mind you, they had great examples of that. They have the polio campaign, and people forget about, especially younger people don't realize just how bad polio was. polio is a really interesting disease. But not just that, coming out of World War II, we actually get the widespread use of penicillin and the penicillins, which are game changers. And again, many people forget about that now and about all the next generation of drugs that kill infection. But remember, we almost didn't have a President Eisenhower because he cut his leg when he was a kid, his knee. He fell and scraped his knee. It got infected, and they talked about taking his leg off. And if they had taken his leg off, he, of course, would not have gone to military school, and he would not have become the Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. And we would not have fought in World Wars I and World War II, and everything would have changed. Once you got penicillin, widespread use of penicillin after World War II, all sorts of things that used to be deadly became not so deadly. Similarly, with the rise of vaccinations, the MMR vaccine, for example, and people took those because they recognized just how deadly those diseases were. And many of us who are here are probably remember getting those vaccines, and you lined up in schools, and everybody was excited to get those vaccines. Well, that idea that the federal government should protect people's health, I'm actually getting back to Abbott, don't worry here, should protect people's health, is part of the idea of that New Deal government. The idea that we should use the federal government in such a way that it protects us, or that it regulates business, or provides a basic social safety net, or promotes infrastructure, that essentially we pool our money to go ahead and do things that are good for all of us. But as you know, my work, I talk about a lot, that was not popular with businessmen who didn't like regulation. They actually disliked regulation a lot more than they disliked taxes at first. But they have worked since the 1950s to go ahead and destroy that idea that the federal government should work to help us all. And that became known in the period after World War II as the liberal consensus. And by that, it did not mean that it was democratic. It meant that it was the idea of the way the government should work. Liberals believed, and this included people in both parties, liberals believed, the majority of both parties, that the government had a role to play regulating big business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. And Democrats and Republicans disagreed about how to do that, but there was this consensus from World War II until at least 1960, when a very famous political scientist, a guy named Converse, wrote this article in which he said, we basically should stop talking about, sort of large principles any longer when we try and get people to come out and vote, because basically the Republicans and the Democrats share the same principles. We're really arguing about the details of how to build a bridge, or who should build a bridge, or things like that. And we basically agree on these things and how it should be done. So he actually takes political voting procedures down a different path that I'm not going to tell you about now. But the point here is that there was, coming out of the 1950s, this attempt on the part of businessmen to undercut this, because they didn't want business regulation. They didn't want taxes. They wanted to create public infrastructure themselves. They wanted that to be privatized so they could make money from it. And what they do beginning in the 1950s is they begin to tie the idea of things like public health programs, but regulation and all that, to the idea that it's going to help people of color, Black people, that's not the word they're using then, by giving them benefits that are paid for by white tax dollars. And I've talked about this a lot. This draws on an old Reconstruction trope, and you can see it after Eisenhower sends troops into Little Rock High School in 1957. But the whole point here is that this was the basis of a new form of political engagement called movement conservatism. And the point is, these people weren't conservatives in the literal sense, the old-fashioned Burkean conservatism, or even the Lincoln conservative, who wanted to stabilize society, wanted to base society in fact, and make sure that you preserved the traditions of society. They used the word conservative, but as part of a political movement. And everybody pointed out when some of the foundational books of this movement came out, written by William F. Buckley Jr., they said, these people aren't conservative, they're radicals. They're radical, they're dangerous radicals. And they sort of accepted that idea because what they wanted to do was they wanted completely to get rid of the idea that the government had a role to play regulating big business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. So where does this get us? This gets us to the modern day Republican Party. And I'm not going to drag you through it because there's a lot of questions here. There's a lot of questions you people want me to answer. But the whole point of movement conservatism was that you needed to get rid of this active government, this government that promoted all the things I just talked about. You had to get rid of the liberal consensus and take the American government back to the 1920s. And in the 1920s, the people who ran the government were businessmen. And they did exactly what I'm talking about. They were the ones who built the roads and built the bridges and charged a pretty penny for it. And they were they were able to do whatever they wanted without regulation. And there wasn't a basic social safety net for people provided by the government. It was provided by families or by churches, and it was obviously inadequate. You look at what happened in the Depression, and the fact that people were starving. It obviously didn't work, but that's what they want to go back to. And the movement conservatives started to work within the Republican Party, and they managed to take control of the White House with Ronald Reagan, who spoke like a movement conservative but didn't actually govern that way. But by the 1990s, the movement conservatives had taken over the Republican Party and read out of the party anyone that they called rhinos, Republicans in name only, which always infuriated me because it was backward. They were the rhinos, and they chased out of the party the old, more traditional Republicans who had really embraced the policies of and the ideology of the Republican Party. What they are embracing is not is a weird sort of extremist version of where you could take the ideology of the Republican Party. All right, so that's the background that gives us Donald Trump, because Donald Trump he's a salesman. He doesn't have political principles at all. Whatever's good for Trump is good for him. But he uses that language of the movement conservatives to say that he's dead set against the people of color and the women who are taking stuff from white guys. I mean, that whole idea of the transfer of wealth from white property owners to people of color and women, that it comes out of the 1950s, had morphed to the idea of that Mexicans are rapists and that women are there for the sexual assaulting. And it has also morphed into the idea that white men of property are just the best, right? You're only the best people. But he deeply embraces the idea of returning the government back to the idea of businessmen running government and of gutting the activist government. And that's exactly what he does. I mean, he doesn't fill positions in the State Department, and you now have people talking about how they have to rebuild their departments because he didn't put anybody in them, or he fired them, and he replaced them with his own underlings, if you will, because there really was, I won't say a principle there, but he really was trying to get us back to the 1920s, although he would not have articulated it that way. Why do I say all this? Because when COVID came to America, one of the reasons, as you know, that it came to America was because we had gotten rid of our epidemic outposts in China. We actually had previously had people stationed there to observe new diseases coming out of China. A lot of diseases come out of China because of some of the environmental conditions in China. They've been pulled back. When John Bolton had taken over as the National Security Advisor, he had gotten rid of the pandemic advisors that sat on the National Security Council. There was a removal of this structure, this superstructure that was supposed to protect us from pandemics. So what happened was, when the pandemic hit, Trump did not go to the idea that the federal government, we should quick as bunnies go ahead and rejuvenate our liberal consensus public health system. He turned it over to private industry. The idea was to turn it over to private industry. And the reason for that is because of this ideology that individuals led by businessmen will be able to handle the crises of modern society better than the federal government. And as you know, it was not what one would call a success. But part of the insistence on no mask wearing, on getting people back to work, on not taking seriously the pandemic as a public health threat was really to reinforce that idea that we don't need a federal government. We don't need regulation of business. What we need to do is turn everything over to businessmen. All right? I hope you're with me on that. So, Abbott. Abbott's in trouble right now because of that whole idea of deregulation is what created this absolute crisis, this heartbreaking crisis in Texas, which, if those of us who come from places where you can die, I always carry blankets in my car in the winter and everything because you know just how quickly cold becomes deadly. I just watched that and thought, oh my God, I can't. Well, anyway, as we know, the reason for that is not because of windmills. The reason that they had that crisis was because the deregulation of the Texas electrical grid, which is limited to Texas so that they can't be regulated by the federal government, that collapsed because they had never invested in any kind of winterizing, even though they knew they had to protect the not the grid. The grid was okay, but to protect the energy going into the grid. I put that badly, but they hadn't done that, and he's getting a lot of flack for that. The fact that that his board screwed up so badly that lots of people died, and more than we think are going to die, and not worse. There's nothing worse than the loss of life, but all those pipes that burst in those houses, they're going to have flooded the walls, and as you probably know, sheetrock absorbs moisture, and basically if a house gets wet, you get about 3 days to dry it out before it molds. And once it molds, there ain't nothing you can do but tear it out and rebuild. And so the economic devastation that's going to hit Texas is going to be off the charts. I mean, anybody who's dealt with mold in a house knows just how bad it is when you've got a moldy house. So he's got that happening. And by the way, it's a really interesting picture because the major Texas city that is not part of that grid was I'm drawing a blank here. El Paso, the one there on the very side, on the western side. That is not tied into the Texas system. It's actually tied into the western grid. We have a number of different grids in the country, and they were fine. They lost power about 2 hours. They were fine because they'd been regulated and they'd winterized. The rest of Texas didn't. So Abbott's got this problem right now because people are angry about the loss of life and the horrific thing they just went through. And lots of people are starting to talk about things like, I don't know, regulation. And what does he want to do? He wants to re-emphasize the idea that regulation's a terrible thing, that you should be able to do whatever you want. You're not going to have Big Brother looking out over you about whether or not you can go to a restaurant or whether or not you can wear a mask. And he's making the calculation that people who support him, that Republicans who support him, are going to be happy enough about this that they're going to be willing to continue to embrace this ideology that Rick Perry, the former Secretary of Energy, was talking about in the middle of that crisis when he said, Texans would go for days without power if it meant that we weren't going to have regulation. So what he's really doing is taking a gamble on doubling down, if you will, on this idea that Americans, at least in Texas, really prefer the lack of no regulation, if it means that they can go without masks, then rather than actually having regulation and having governments say, hey, leave the masks on another month until we actually get the vaccines into arms and then take them off, which is what is the much more, I think, safer thing to do. All right, so that's probably more than you wanted to know about Texas. Let me go here quickly. March 4th, what's going on? What's going on with March 4th is QAnon has moved back the date at which they expect Donald Trump to be inaugurated for a second term from January 20th, as you know. First it was supposed to be January 6th, then January 20th, and now they're talking about March 4th because until the 1930s, March 4th was the traditional day of inaugurations for presidents. So it's FDR who switches it to January 20th, in part to cut down the amount of time that the previous president can mess with the next president, and in part to just because you don't need that kind of time any longer because they have faster means of transportation, and of course now we can do it pretty quickly because we have airplanes. That being said, a lot of people are like, why is there any kind of a lag at all? And the reason for that is because, unlike many countries, we don't have a shadow government. So in a lot of systems, what they do is you have one party in power, but there's sort of a shadow. The other party is a shadow of that. So if the parties switch an election, you can just start work the next day. We don't have that. Biden had to get his teams up and running and had to get up to speed with what the previous president had been doing. So that's why that's going on, and that's why March 4th is an issue. I just read today, I haven't looked at the news much, but I read today the Capitol Police are adding more people for January 4th, and that's why the National Guard is still in Washington, is because they're concerned about what might happen on January 4th. I will say that I worry less about the January 4th than I have about other moments, simply because, forewarned is forearmed, and I am less concerned about that than I am some certain other dates. Certainly could be wrong. All right, somebody asked a fabulous question. What are the 3 main downsides to ending the filibuster? And I loved this question because it's really easy to argue what you believe, but it's always fun. So people, it's interesting. And one of the things I want to talk about today was that when I talk about things, like 2 days ago, I wrote a piece about the COVID-19 bill, which I'll tell you about. But I got some really angry people who thought I was advocating for that bill. And if you actually read the bill, read the piece I wrote, I wasn't advocating for the bill at all. It was a completely different piece using the bill as an example. I was trying to say we have a problem in our democracy when we have a measure that 76% of Americans want, including 60% of Republicans, and it can't even get a hearing with one of our major parties. It was a discussion about democracy, but it was really interesting to me how many people can't see a discussion that is not Republican-Democrat, that everything has to come down to this fight between two parties. And we actually need a public space where we can talk about our democracy and what we think is appropriate behavior in our democracy, and about things like, about the filibuster. So one of the reasons I like this question was that that's a great way to think about questions, not thinking about why you like something, but what is the argument for not liking it. And somebody wrote to me and challenged me, and I don't know if she's listening now, I'm not even sure she still follows me, but when I was talking about changing either the filibuster or the electoral college, she said, no, we need to defend small states. And I'm from a small state, and I thought, maybe she's right. And it was interesting because I was going out that day and I talked to a whole bunch of people about what they thought, and their answers were completely different than I had thought. And interestingly enough, most of them thought that that the isolation of small states has actually hurt them politically, not helped them, which I may talk about someday. But I thought her question was a really good one, and she convinced me. But then when I took it to other people, they were like, no, I think she's wrong, but for entirely different reasons than I thought. So I loved this question that said, let's take the other side. So the downsides, what do people argue about against the filibuster? Well, I'm going to throw in something here that I argue, and it appears I'm the only person, about why I like the filibuster. I like traditions. But that's completely knee-jerk, and I have come around to believing that the filibuster is a bad idea. But let me tell you why some people still defend it. And interestingly enough, if you Google why do we still need the filibuster, it's hard to find a lot of mainstream discussions of that. And I took I was actually in a lot of fairly right-wing publications and some mainstream ones, but the people on the right who defend it are fairly far out there. People on the left are more in the middle, at least as I could tell on a cursory examination. So one of the reasons that people think that we should keep the filibuster is, first of all, they say that it's a good thing to make laws hard to pass. That the filibuster, by the way, is, as I've talked about before, it is not in the Constitution. It is a weird accidental outgrowth of the way we have done business. So in both houses at the beginning, there was no way to end debate because they were small, and you talk yourself out and you have a vote, right? The House had to find a way to stop debate early because it grew so fast. The Senate did not grow as fast. So the Senate never really came up with a very good process to end debate. It now has developed a system called cloture, which is a horrible word, by the way. And by that, if you bring cloture to a vote, that can pass with a majority vote, and it gives you 30 more hours to continue to debate, a maximum of 30 more hours. So there is a way to end debate, but it's not easy to do. So so the filibuster is simply you refuse to stop talking. You just keep talking, and that would mean that a bill would never come up for a vote. And people say, oh, well, that was traditional, that was in the vote. Well, technically, yeah, because nobody ever said we got to have a way to stop the vote. We got to stop a debate. But it's not. It was never like anybody voted on it. They just didn't stop talking. Really, was almost never used until the 20th century, and it becomes discussed. It becomes used in the 20th century to stop civil rights bills. People like Strom Thurmond don't want there to be civil rights. So rather than letting that pass, even though it's got huge majorities, he talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks until he kills it. So it became this way for an entrenched minority to stop quite popular legislation. And then it really has absolutely taken off with the recent rise of these movement conservatives who won't compromise, because if what you're trying to do is take the government, get rid of the government, the current government, you can't compromise. You can't say, okay, well, we'll just build it a little bit over here, because you've given away the whole game if you move at all. So they just basically stopped everything. And you saw this in the last Congress with Mitch McConnell, who had hundreds of bills on his desk that he simply said, no, we're not going to bring them up, because what happens is in the late 20th century, as there are more and more bills, they can't really afford to let people filibuster, so they let senators simply put a hold on bills, saying I would filibuster if it came up. So you don't ever have to bring anything up, with the exception of a very few must-pass bills, and those can't be filibustered. And that's how we get those 3 things that can be passed by budget reconciliation every year, because we need the budget. So those have to be passed. And as you know, when the movement conservatives, when the Republicans started to make it impossible for the Democrats to put any judges in, Harry Reid killed the filibuster for Democratic Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid killed the filibuster for judicial appointments, but kept it for the Supreme Court. And Mitch McConnell went ahead and killed it for the Supreme Court as well. So there are ways in which the filibuster gets killed. But the argument for keeping it is that it's a really good thing to make it hard to pass bills, because we shouldn't have a lot of laws. And my answer to that is, I can't think of a word that is not obscene. That's ridiculous. I mean, I study Congress. I read the congressional record. We have always passed bills. We've always had laws, and they have always passed by majority votes, by a simple majority. That's the way it was set up. That's the way it's been done until very, very recently. So that one I'm just going to throw right out. The idea that I like tradition, that should also go out too, because that's just me being stupid. The idea that it needs to be really, really hard to pass laws, that gets thrown out too, as far as I'm concerned, because what we've got instead nowadays is something I'm very much against, and that is the idea that because we can't get anything to the floor of the Senate, everything gets thrown at the end of the year into these super bills that people either have to accept as a whole or throw out as a whole. And that's no way to legislate. I mean, we really have to have debates, and people should say, yeah, I really think it's a great idea to do X and not Y. This business of having a several $1 trillion bill, and you either take it or you don't. I mean, I'm so against that. Someone's gonna have to convince me that's a good thing. But anyways, so I don't buy that one either. One of the other arguments is that if you get rid of the filibuster, it's going to make everything partisan. That in order to get something through the Senate with the filibuster, it forces things to be bipartisan. But here's my objection to that. What it really essentially means in this era, when the Republicans have baked in such an extraordinary advantage in both the House and the Senate, as you know, the 50 Republican senators in the Senate currently represent about 41.5 million fewer people than the Democrats do. They've got a structural advantage there, and they also have a structural advantage in the House of Representatives, a significant one. What that means is essentially the Republicans can stop anything they want simply by by guaranteeing that the Democrats can't get those extra 10 votes. And a great example of that is this COVID relief bill, which 76% of the American people want, and which is not probably going to go through because of that. But another great example, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I spoke too quickly there. I'll walk you through that. Another great example is gun control after Sandy Hook. That passed the House of Representatives, and it had 55 votes in the Senate, but it couldn't get those last 5 votes, and it failed. Even though, like 70% of America wanted that bill as well, it couldn't get through. So rather than saying that the filibuster makes things bipartisan, what it's done is it's made everything hideously partisan, I think. And if you look at how the numbers stack up when they started using the filibusters in a huge way, and how partisan things have been since that time. I think the partisanship came before the overuse of the filibuster, not the other way around. And now the other thing that people talk about in the dangers of the filibuster is that it will mean that the Democrats will come in and they'll do one thing, and then it'll flip, and the Republicans will do another, and then it'll flip back, and we'll be sort of on the seesaw all the time. Maybe, but here's my concern. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think maybe we should sit there and say, oh yeah, okay, let's try driving 55 on the highways, or let's try, I don't know, I can never think of anything when I go to do this. Let's try it. And if people don't like it, sure, let the next party switch it. But so I'm okay with that because, again, I read the congressional record actually for fun on occasion in the past, and that's how things were done. And it worked. So I have reason to believe it would work again. But here's why I worry about not doing it, and that's that we have a different problem now. Because the filibuster has essentially paralyzed Congress, power has shifted dramatically to the White House and to the executive branch, which is big, by the way. It's hundreds of thousands of people. We think of the president, but it's actually the State Department and the Justice Department and all these huge departments. And that really worries me, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office. And what we've got right now is we've got, Trump did all kinds of things with executive orders and with not filling positions and all that. And now they're flipped on their head by Biden. He has done just the opposite and changed everything through executive, not just orders, executive memos and things like that. And if a Republican is elected again, we're going to flip again. And if you're looking at flipping, those people are not responsible on a day-to-day basis to their constituents. That's not the way our system was set up. So when I come around to when I look at why, what are the downsides to ending the filibuster, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, it's old. I like old stuff. I just can't see a reason to keep it. But that being said, our problems run much deeper than the filibuster. And you've heard me talk about this before, and it makes people angry when I say this. We have a problem in our democracy when our system is this undemocratic. When you have a Senate, this is this heavily shifted toward a minority of the population. When you have a House of Representatives that is this badly gerrymandered and that is this badly, that this entirely, so completely favors rural states, which happened in 1929 with the capping of the House of Representatives at 435. We've got this wildly undemocratic system right now, and all of these pieces need to be fixed, and they can't be fixed one at a time. We really have to make them fixed all together, and I hope to get more into that as well. All right, so people are asking. Let me go to the American Rescue Plan next, even though there's other things I want to say about that. Somebody asked, what do I think of the American Rescue Plan, and why are there so many apparently non-COVID related items? Well, that's really interesting. That idea that they're non-COVID related items comes from the floor of Congress when a member from North Carolina, a Republican member from North Carolina, said only 9% of the stuff in this bill is related to COVID. And that was wildly misleading. If you actually look at discussions of this, people are like, oh, come on. because what he was saying was that 9% of it is directly related to vaccines. And some of the other things, not all of it, but some of the other things related to the actual virus, and combating the virus. But the whole point of this bill was to be an economic package to heal the nation from the ravages of COVID. So the bill itself is, it helps local and state businesses that didn't get tax dollars. It does all sorts of things to address the economic problem of COVID. So no, when you're helping out a state budget, you are not directly dealing with the virus. You're dealing with the fact that the states are in this terrible crunch because of COVID. So that was a real red herring. Now, one of the things in the bill, though, that's interesting is that there are things like a child credit, a $3,000 child credit. And that's, and people say, that's ridiculous. That's a wish list. Well, maybe. And this is one thing that I think we should be discussing. One of the reasons it's in there is because if you look at the statistics, this pandemic has devastated women in the workplace. It has devastated them. I mean, we're going to be recovering from this for a generation. And some of the material in this particular bill, as opposed to the past one, was designed to try and help women get back on their feet in the workplace. And so people are complaining about that child credit, saying this is just a wish list, and other people are saying it's not a wish list, it's trying to help this economic crisis. So what do I think of the American Rescue Plan? I hate to actually talk about current day stuff because I'm actually not trying to be a shill for anybody and anything. But if I am forced to take a stand, I will say that there's a lot going on right now. And one of the things that this particular bill does is it sends a really big message that the United States government is not going to continue funneling money upward, that it's going to be using our money to help ordinary Americans. And people are complaining about the fact that there's $1,400 in the bill for people who may not need it. And my reaction to that is, let's take a look at what happened under the Trump administration to the monies from the previous bills. And we know an awful lot of it went to places that, at least in my mind, didn't really need them very much. And similarly, Trump's tax cut. One of the things I wrote to somebody, one of the things that bothers me when we talk about things like this is that, you can sit there and say, well, so my neighbor didn't need $1,400. First of all, we don't know because we don't know what your neighbor looks like. But we talk about individual things, or in the COVID-19 bill, the fact that the new one, the American Rescue Plan, that there is $1.5 million that's earmarked for a bridge in Elise Stefanik's, the Republican upstate New York, Elise Stefanik's district. That has nothing to do with COVID. Well, yeah, okay. But when we talk about that, first of all, she's a Republican, so when I get that from Republicans, that always kind of irritates me. But we talk about very specific things when we talk about helping ordinary Americans. We talk about $1,400, which is a lot of money. But when you are looking at funding big things in this country, handing somebody $1,400 does not begin to compare to, for example, Trump's 2017 tax bill, which provided hundreds of thousands of dollars apiece to people in the top 1 and top 0.1%. And we don't itemize those things. We just sort of say, oh, the money went upward. And so somehow we tend to forget about that. And I feel like we've got two languages for the way we talk about the expenditures of money in this country. We have individuals who, maybe we're giving money to somebody who doesn't need it. Everybody cheats the system sometime. But I shouldn't say everybody, because I hope that there are many people who don't. I certainly hope I've never done it. But I know people who have. But that's a different problem than setting up a system that routinely funnels trillions of dollars upward. And so when we have these things and we say, well, I hate that this $1,000 got wasted. Yeah, okay. But what about this $1,000 million over here? So I get upset when we talk about things like this bill and complain about the things in it, which probably if I were doing it, I wouldn't write it this way. But I'm not doing it. I hired somebody else to do it. And then we don't put on the same scale, let's take a look at who got the money from the PPP the last time. Let's take a look at where our tax dollars have gone. And I think what you're going to find, I know, since 1981, our government has funneled money upward at an extraordinary rate. So our system is currently incredibly heavily weighted against ordinary Americans. And so I look at this rescue plan and I think, if the chairman of the Fed, who's Trump put at the head of the Fed, and the Secretary of the Treasury, and mayors and state governors and economists and politicians look at this, who know a lot more about this stuff than I do, look at this and think this is the way to go, and they believe that the federal government should be helping ordinary Americans, okay, I'm in. Similarly, I suspect if you looked at the Trump tax cut, there's probably stuff in it that I like. I mean, I actually haven't read a lot of it, but I'm sure there's something in that I like. But I look at the whole package and say, this represents a government that believes that rich people should run the country. And I don't believe that. That's not the country I want to live in. And so maybe that's not very helpful as to whether or not I like it. I'm actually a bit of a deficit hawk, believe it or not. But I'm not sure this is the place to become a deficit hawk. And I'm very suspicious of people who are perfectly willing to cut taxes and spend our money moving upward and not help ordinary Americans. So people are showing me, saying, they're complaining that I'm saying that many people don't need the $1,400. That's not what I was trying to say at all. I was trying to be on a macro level here. People are hurting very badly right now, and I hope that that's clear, that I'm in favor of the government helping ordinary Americans through this crisis rather than continuing to funnel money upward. All right. By the way, it seems like there's arguments going on over here. Please be aware that we do get hit very badly with trolls when I do these, because nobody can hit them while I'm talking. All right, so a couple more questions. Some things here that are interesting. A lot of things that are interesting, actually, really interesting, actually. But somebody asked about how the Biden administration should handle Saudi Arabia, which I think is a really interesting question. And I am not an expert on foreign affairs to any deep degree, but one of the things that I thought was interesting about the recent reaction to the new report about the fact that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was responsible for the death of Jamal Khashoggi, I thought was the whole reaction to that was really, really interesting. As you know, I was all over that, and really all over that. And of course, took that really personally in many ways, because I have a thing about Putin and journalists for many reasons. But I'm sorry, and that was not Putin. But I have a thing about dictators killing journalists. And Khashoggi, I found a really interesting and a great writer. I mean, I knew his writings. But what was interesting about that was the way that we handled the anger over it. So if you actually went back to my writings, you would see that Trump had to release that report to Congress when he was president, and he didn't do it. He just didn't do it. And people kind of dropped it. And I wrote a lot about that, because I'm like, he can't do that. He can't not give it over. But he did just not give it over, and nobody called him on it. There was a little bit of face saving, but not enough. So the Biden administration, under Avril Haines, Director of National Intelligence, handed it over. This was filling the job that should have been done years ago. And it was interesting because this was nothing we didn't know, but this was the official word about it. But let's think about what that looks like. So people were furious that Biden did not sanction the Crown Prince. And I don't know the answer to this, but I read that, and I'm always interested in the way that politicians move chess pieces. So it's really easy when you see something that you really don't like, and you think, they didn't do what I wanted here. But one of the things that Biden has been really clever about, to my mind, since he took office, is he never moves just a single piece. So one of the things that really surprises me, or surprised me especially with his dealing with climate change, and there was a big announcement about that early on, many people missed it because he moved like 7 pieces at once. And they were little moves, but they added up to such a big move that Bill McKibben, who's one of the major writers on climate change, is like, this is the biggest day in climate change history. And it kind of flew under the radar screen. So when Biden sanctioned a number of people in Saudi Arabia and pulled out of supporting the war in Yemen that had been backed by the Crown Prince, and refused to continue the arms sales to Saudi Arabia that they so badly need to keep that war in Yemen going. These are all separate pieces. But what I saw, and who knows, I could absolutely be wrong, was an attempt to put, and by the way, he didn't release that report until after he had talked to the Crown Prince's father, who's apparently mentally not 100% with it. What I wonder is, was this an attempt to put pressure on the royal family, which is a lot of people, like hundreds of people, more than hundreds of people, but only 100 real movers and shakers, to pick a different crown prince, because there have been 3 crown princes just in the last 5 years. MBS is consolidating his power over them. You may remember back a little bit ago, he threw a whole bunch of people in prison, but they don't like him. He's gotten them involved in a war that is a huge, boondog, whatever the word is when you get into a war and you shouldn't have, and it's blowing up in your face. Yemen has been a disaster for them. He no longer has Trump protecting him. Remember, he comes into power after Trump's already in office. He becomes crown prince in 2017, I think it is. And of course, Biden has said there's going to be more coming out, more effort to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. I'm willing to take a wait and see attitude, because it struck me that if he went directly after the crown prince, what choice does the royal family have but to defend him? Whereas by putting pressure on members of the royal family instead and saying, we're not going to go after your leadership, but we are going to go after you, I thought that might put pressure on them to change it. I don't know. But I'm not willing to say, there were all those articles, Biden did this stupid thing, he's letting a murderer get away. And I thought, I don't know, I'm not a diplomat, but I'm not at all willing to agree that there's not diplomacy at work here. I guess we'll see. Who knows? All right, so a couple other things. What are we at? We're 10 minutes here. So one thing I wanted to say here, people have asked about a couple of things here. Will Trump ever be held accountable for January 6th? Who knows? And one of the things that I would urge people to remember is we have all seen what the House Impeachment Committee put together, and it looks really damning. It looks really damning. But remember, that was not a court of law, and we are not in a court of law. And Trump has not been charged with anything yet. Nobody that we suspect, at least that I suspect, of being complicit in things has been charged with anything yet. And this is why we have a system. So I will privately say lots of things to my friends about who I think is guilty and all that. But there's a reason that we have a system that says you're innocent until proven guilty. And these things need to go through that system. So right now, who knows if he will be held accountable in a court of law. But this ties into the next question that somebody asked, and that is, how will all this end? How can, somebody said, how have we been taken over by aliens? How do we return this country to a fair and equal democracy, or get this country to a fair and equal democracy? And one of the pieces that I really want to emphasize here is that there is one group of people in this country who have the trump card, who win every single time that they want to play. And that's the American people. And that's how our system is set up. And if you want to see Trump held accountable, make sure that that's the position you take, and that you talk about it, and that you write letters to the editor about it, and that you insist that your members of Congress follow up, and that you organize voters, and that you run for office. Because at the end of the day, whether or not Trump is going to be held accountable is entirely up to the voters. Going forward, is he going to be able to pull off the coup that he is still trying to pull off? Or are we going to stand up and take our country back? And I don't mean that in any violent way, I promise you. I mean it in a democratic way. And one of the things, of course, that I'm harping on right now, and that is that these voter suppression bills around the country are a really huge deal. They are the biggest deal. They're bigger than virtually anything. I have a hard time saying anything's bigger than COVID, because the fact that we are at over 500,000 people dead officially, there's more than that unofficially, I just can't even get my mind around. I can't believe we're here, and yet here we are. So I hate to say anything's more important than that, but these voter suppression bills, they are, if they go through, the reason I wrote about Jim Crow legislation and voter suppression in the South last night, if we go that direction, we know as historians exactly where that goes, and that goes to terrorism against people who are expected to vote against the dominant party. And when I say terrorism, I mean obviously the open murder of people who vote the wrong way and who look the wrong way. And one of the images that I looked for last night, I actually finished the piece and then was looking for two pieces of information. And you may remember the deputy and one of the other people who was involved in the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in 1964 in Mississippi, laughing at the idea that they would be held to account for murdering people who were trying to organize voters. And people are like, oh, that couldn't happen here. Excuse me, that happened here in my lifetime. We have been here, and those people are still alive. I mean, we are in a position right now where we are talking about putting those people back in power. And once they are in power, what will it look like? We know what it looks like. It looks like the 1920s. It looks like lynching. It looks like one of the reasons that people like Rosa Parks organized the Montgomery bus boycott was because of how many African American women were getting raped in southern cities. And who was going to call a white man to account for raping a black woman? That's the world that we are looking at. And they're trying to make it national. And if you are looking for a place to put energy right now, it's in stopping these voter suppression bills. And the larger story behind them is this. A lot of people are like, why do I care if, somebody in Detroit votes? I live in, pick a place anywhere. I live in, Maryland or Maine. Why would I care? You care because once we start to say in this country that we're not all equal, that some people are good enough to vote and other people aren't good enough to vote, you're starting to make distinctions about who is welcome to have a say in our society and who is not. And once you've accepted that principle, once it's okay for you to say, well, it's all right if they don't let those old, church-going black people in Georgia vote. I don't really care about old black church-going people in Georgia. I just care about, fishermen in Maine. Once you start to say that, what you have said is, I agree with the principle that some people shouldn't have rights. I want to have rights still, but they shouldn't have rights. But once you have accepted that principle, once you have let that principle be written into our laws, it is only a question of time until you are one of those people who doesn't have rights. It is only a question of time once that principle is established that you are on the losing end of it. Unless, of course, you become one of the very, very few people at the top, and good luck with that, because by definition they're a really small percentage of the population, usually under 10% and often only 1%. So that's where the real rubber is meeting the road right now, is are we going to be a country in which everybody has a say in their government and is treated equally before the laws, or are we not? Are we going to go ahead and say it's okay if some people don't vote? They don't really have the rights of other people. And so basically we have a multi-tiered system of justice in America, and we don't really care about equality before the law. And once we've done that, the game's over. The game is over. I don't actually think it's going to come to that. Somebody's just asking about HR1. This is why people are putting such emphasis on HR1, is because HR1 is a very long bill, by the way, and it tries to deal with voter suppression. It tries to deal with big money in politics. It tries to address Citizens United. It tries to address gerrymandering. It tries to do this major overhaul of our political system. And this is why the Republicans have said it's absolutely not going to happen. And the real question here is whether the Democrats will go ahead and kill the filibuster in order to pass it. And interestingly enough, certain Democrats are saying no, people like Joe Manchin. And there's a lot of people from West Virginia, and a lot of people are sort of saying, oh, Joe Manchin isn't a Democrat. Joe Manchin is a Democrat, and it's worth noting that he is from a very red state, so he's in a very precarious position. But one of the things always to remember about this political moment, or any really, and I sort of alluded to it before, is that Joe Manchin is a Democrat, but Joe Manchin is also a businessman. And just because, as I say, we're in this weird moment where people divide everything according to Republican versus Democrat, although an awful lot of us don't see the world as Republican Democrat. We see the world as, in my case, democracy, or in other people's cases, business, or in some people's cases, spirituality, whatever. It's important to remember that Manchin's interests are not necessarily in advancing the interests of the Democrats as a party, although he's a Democrat, but he's also interested in business. So whether or not they can get Manchin and Sinema on board to kill the filibuster in order to pass HR1 is not at all clear. There's also the much more limited John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, and that is designed to replace the parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the Supreme Court gutted in Shelby v. Holder in 2013, I think, off the top of my head. No. Sorry. I can't remember off the top of my head when Shelby v. Holder was. Sorry about that. There was one last thing I wanted to end on. Voter suppression, we did that. Aliens, sort of did that. And I think the final question I want to answer with is this one. Can the current Congress prevent an authoritarian takeover of democracy? And this is a really big question, because there is a huge problem in our current Congress. The fact that a number of Republican senators led by Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley of Texas and Missouri, respectively, and more than 100 members of the House of Representatives were willing to challenge the counting of the certified ballots after the 2020 election on January 6th is hugely problematic. That was not simply paperwork. That was an attack on the foundations of our democracy. And those people are still sitting in Congress. I am one of those people of the minds that they should be expelled for that under the 14th Amendment, because I think it's time to play hardball and take our country back. So can Congress stop the direction we're going? I want to reiterate again that Congress works for us, that we can stop that. Whether or not Congress will is a different question. Certainly a number of Democrats are killing themselves out there to make it happen, but they're actually working with the same people who tried to overturn our government. So who's the ultimate answer to all of this? Once again, we are. What we do, what we as American citizens do, is going to answer whether we are able to keep our democracy. So at the end of the day, is it Congress? No, it's us. It's all going to come down to us, to organizing voters, to making sure people get the right information, and to standing up for democratic principles, not on a partisan basis, although of course nowadays it looks partisan, but because we care about our democracy, because honest to God, we're close to losing it. That being said, I think we'll pull it out. We always have in the past, but the time is long gone to look for somebody else to do it for us. We're the backstop. It's time for us to do it. That's about it for tonight. I think it's 5 o'clock, and thank you for being here. I feel like I was all over the map today, but it's been a very long day, and I will see you next time. I'm not positive I will be here Thursday because they switched my Wednesday Thursday teaching schedule, and I think I'm here, but I don't remember. But I will give you a heads up about that. Otherwise, I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you for being here. And of course, as usual, I will be writing to you. Thanks for being here.